Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be going over my 2020 reading highlights and lowlights. I usually don't do like a favorites and least favorite reads of the year because I am just really bad at picking my favorites. If I'm coming up with a list of like my top 5 or my top 10, I'm always like, I don't know, the numbers might be wrong. Like maybe a few months from now or definitely a few years from now, I'm not gonna agree with myself, and for some reason it bothers me. But to spare all of us from that overthinking nonsense that I would definitely do if that was gonna be my approach, I usually do things in more of kind of like a category sense, a little bit more qualitative, and usually these kind of change year to year. I don't really have a strict methodology for what I'm doing because it's just kind of based on how I feel like talking about my reading from the past year. My reading this year ranged from pretty much like middling to good, so I wouldn't say that I have that many books that I'm gonna like snark on pretty heavily. This is gonna be mostly books that I enjoyed, but when I do talk about books that I was frustrated with, they were very frustrating. So my first category is my favorite audiobook that I listened to in 2020, and this is going to be a pair of books because they're a series, they're a duology. I basically listened to them back to back, and this is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing and A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green. Between the two of these books, there's a pretty big cast of narrators, so I'm going to list all of their names on the screen because they're an important part of my audiobook listening experience. Book 1, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, starts with April May, an artist who stumbles on this metal sculpture in the middle of New York and then finds out that she may have accidentally made first contact. This whole thing turns her into like an internet celebrity, it turns her into a cable news personality, but it also potentially puts her in charge of saving the world. And then in book 2, A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor, we continue on with the story. We meet more of her friends and see more of their point of view and see how all of these connect together and how everyone is gonna have to save the world at this point. Just as a quick disclosure, I work for Hank Green in various different capacities, and so if you want to take this review with a grain of salt, that is perfectly fine. I think that's totally fair because I do think that that impacts the way that I read this book and the way that I review it. In terms of the audio bookness of it all, I really enjoyed this production. It reminded me a lot of the production for Sadie by Courtney Summers, where they're really taking advantage of the audio format to showcase, you know, a lot of different elements of the story. The main narrator was Kristen Shea. She voiced April May in books 1 and 2, and I thought she did such a great job of like bringing out the fact that April May is this really charismatic but also like frustrating and messy character. I thought she just had that right, I don't know, performance for it. And then in book 2, when you're kind of moving over to having a much larger cast and bringing in the perspectives and point of views and voices of all of these other side characters, I really love that, not just because the book did that itself, where it like branched out from just being told from April May's perspective, but also having that actually brought to life through the different narrators was really special, and I just really loved how it tied everything together. And these books deal with these big picture questions that are super important at any time, but that feel, you know, of course, especially relevant right now. You know, there are questions about like, how do people work together to solve gigantic problems? And how do our worst impulses shape the media that gets made and what we consume? And like, what is the point of fame? And also like, what are our worst impulses or what are our best impulses? And like, how do we, I don't know, how do we manage all of those things? Those are questions that can and do often lead to a lot of very self-indulgent and very easy cynicism, but I really appreciated that this book didn't really take that easy route, that I was really interested in saying like, I don't know, can we make something more meaningful and more joyful out of this big mess? Okay, so next up is going to be one of my few frustrating reads of the year, and the category that I am putting this book into is the most frustrating last 10 pages of a book. And the book that has won this dubious honor for me is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I am putting Daisy Jones in this category because I actually loved almost all of this book. Daisy Jones and the Six is a fictional oral history of the fictional musician Daisy Jones and her collaboration with the fictional band The Six. Over the course of this oral history, told through like the band members' perspectives and the perspectives of other people around them, just like any good oral history, you know, you learn all these things about the personal relationships and the issues with drugs and alcohol and like the musical like whateverness, the museness of it all that creates friction and success within this band. I went into this book with a lot of caution because I was sort of in that minority that didn't particularly enjoy The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but I thought that a lot of the writing issues that I had with Evelyn Hugo would basically be completely resolved by this oral history structure, and that actually turned out to be the case. A lot of the things that I found frustrating in terms of kind of like feeling like things were a little bit overwritten, that didn't really happen here because the oral history format just like automatically makes you make things more concise. And so I really enjoyed that about this book, and it paired really well with how great Reid is at like drawing you into a story of an individual person's life. And so I was fully on board to give this book 5 stars. I was loving it. I was reading it all in one day. I was so into it. And then I got to the last 10 pages and I am still so mad about it months later. And I don't actually know if it's 10 pages. I'm just using 10 pages as an arbitrary thing. Maybe it was 5, maybe it was 15. I have no idea. However many pages it was, they made me mad. And the reason I was mad at those last few pages was the same thing that I was mad at with the ending of Evelyn Hugo, where there's this huge unnecessary reveal that just tied things together in a way that like it did not need. And in Evelyn Hugo, the reason why that bothered me was because there was all of this build up to this big reveal and you find out and I just didn't care. In Daisy Jones, I actually cared what this reveal was because for me, what was actually maddening about it was that it completely undermined what I thought the book was doing in terms of building up the story that goes into like toxic relationships and addiction and really is like making a point about like how two people can be like perfect for each other in some ways and be absolutely not right for each other in every other way, in ways that are really important. And the way that this ending is constructed just really undermined a lot of the work that the book had done that I had been so into when I was reading it obsessively for the first however many chapters. And moreover, like this is a book about rock and roll. And so like one of the things that I was liking was that it was feeling really like messy. Like that oral history structure is like very chaotic. The way that these storylines were like branching and diverging was really chaotic in a way that like actually really works for what the story was about. And so by tying everything together in this really neat, cute way at the end, it just undermined a lot of the feeling of the book along with all of what I had thought the themes were of the book. And so for me, this is a book that if like someone had just taken the book out of my hands like right before I got to that point, I probably would still be like, this is a 5-star read for me. But because I read those last few pages, I was ultimately really disappointed. So I do also have a counterpart to this category, and these are the most exhilarating last 10 pages of a book. And again, 10 pages, a little bit arbitrary. The point is that it's just like really truly like right at the end of the book. So the book that wins this award for me is Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which was written by Cho Nam-ju and was translated from the original Korean into English by Jamie Chang. This was a book that I'd had on my radar for a little while. I had heard about the movie and heard that that had gotten a lot of acclaim, and then like heard that it was actually based on a book. And so I was like, you know, I should read this at some point. What turned into like the final push that I needed was actually a really great series that The Poptimist did over the summer featuring Korean works in translation. And I'll link to his video on Kim Ji-young down below because it provides a lot of really great context for how this book was like received in Korea at the time that it was published. Kim Ji-young, born 1982, is a pretty short, fast read. We follow Kim Ji-young, a South Korean woman who has recently had a breakdown of sorts. It's pretty mysterious. The book traces her history from childhood to adulthood as she deals with micro and macro aggressions towards women, from the unconscious messaging sent to girls about their worth, to the overt threats to their physical bodies, to the choices she has to make as a professional woman who is also wanting to have a family. And, you know, these are choices that a lot of women have to make. And the book is deliberately broad, even as it creates the specific narrative out of Kim Ji-young's life. And there are ways that I really feel like this book, you know, kind of could have bordered on the more trite pieces of like Western feminist lit kind of stuff that you might see like in magazines and blogs and stuff. But Cho is setting the story in the specifics of Korean history and economics over several generations, which gives it a lot of context, which I think is really useful. One of the most striking things as I was reading the book was just like how efficient and almost like clinical the prose is. And I'm reading a translation, so I can't speak to like what the original Korean reads like, but it was a choice that was really striking. And it's also a choice that seems pretty deliberate given the way that the book sets up its final few pages. Like it becomes very clear that that very academic, detached tone has a real purpose to it. And it builds to this last paragraph that is just so perfect and so enraging. And I'm so glad I read it because I feel like every time I think about that paragraph now and like in the future, I'm gonna be mad in a way that like really suits this book and I think really gets to the core of what it's trying to accomplish. Next up, I want to talk about my favorite comfort read for the year. Obviously 2020 kind of needed a few comfort reads and romance really came through for me in a big way. I've been reading romance for a long time, but last year definitely I really needed the genre, and so shout out to all of the romance authors who have brought all of us so much joy. Picking one is difficult because there were a lot of romance novels that I read, but I'm gonna go with the one that I actually turned to multiple times, which is kind of unusual, and this is Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reid. Heated Rivalry is about two NHL players, Shane and Ilya, who are secretly boning each other, except they're also major rivals. Their teams are huge rivals. They are both like the same player on the opposite hockey teams. I don't know that much about hockey, but anyways, they are big rivals, but also big secretly boning each other for several years. And of course, with that comes the realization that they might actually kind of like each other, and that is also difficult to deal with. Like I said, this is a book that I actually turned to multiple times over the course of the year, and it's not something I originally expected, because when I read this book in the beginning of 2020, I liked it, but it didn't like particularly stand out to me in any way. But at some point in the middle of the summer, I decided to reread Heated Rivalry along with the rest of the books in this series, which I hadn't read before. And for some reason this time, Heated Rivalry really hit me right. Like I really, really enjoyed it. And I also like ended up rereading it several times later in the year when I was just like in full brain is mush mode. And I think what I've come to love about rereading this book in particular is just like the fact that we're following these two characters over a really long period in their lives. You know, I think for romance novels, you know, just kind of by necessity how a lot of them are set up, they tend to take place over a somewhat short a period of time. And especially as someone who is a fan of like enemies to lovers or rivals to lovers who like loves that kind of trope, that is a trope that does not always play out as well as I would love in like romance novels. I think it works really well in like, you know, longer series, but like in like standalone romance novels, it's hard to see done well because those novels are often taking place over, again, like weeks to months, and that is not necessarily the amount of time that you need for a good enemies to lover situation where you're like both buying that they once hated each other and also buying that they can have a functional relationship together. Like you need some time to tease that out. But Heated Rivalry is a rivals to lover story. It's basically in the title, and because it's taking place over the course of a whole decade almost, I think, like you are actually getting to see both the individual characters and their relationship with each other and with their friends and family. You're getting to see it over a really long period of time that really kind of like helps you understand this arc in a really clear way. And when I was rereading it, I was really impressed by the fact that the book makes you feel that length of time and like really makes you feel the characters change over this really long period of their life where they're going from like, I think like when they're like just starting out in their careers to like much further along. Like you're able to feel the weight of that progress without it ever feeling dragged or also ever having it feel like it's being rushed in any way. It's really paced nicely, and I think it just makes the whole story land in this really comforting way where you really are following these characters over a really long period of their life as they go through these major changes, both individually and together. Of course, not all romance novels can be comfort reads. Sometimes they're not even enjoyable reads. And that brings me to Frederica by Georgette Hires, who I think is one of those kind of like classic Regency romance writers. Frederica is about Frederica, who is trying to get her sister married, so she like has to go to Lord Alverstoke to help her get her sister married. And then of course she and this Lord guy, they end up in love or something. Frederica is what I'm considering my most emphatic DNF of 2020 because that is what it is. Probably most of my DNFs last year were like either books that I was just kind of like, like I don't think this is really for me, or they were books where the library was like, hey, you gotta like return this, and I didn't get a chance to finish it, but like I kind of want to get to them later. Like there are very few like real hardcore DNFs for me last year. This though, I had to fully commit to DNFing because I was just getting so mad at it. I was just so put off by how smug Frederica was, how smug Lord Alverstoke was, how smug the two of them together were. I don't know if there's any smut in this book, but if there is, it's probably just the two of them getting off on the sight of the other one being smug. It's been a while since I've read this book, so I do not remember all of the details, so forgive me if I mess some of this up. But I'm pretty sure that the point at which I decided to DNF this book was when Frederica is like at the park with her dog, and then she just kind of like lets him off a leash, and he like immediately goes and wreaks havoc. And then I think she and like the Lord guy, they go and like smugly lie to some authority figures about what happened so that like she's kind of let off the hook, even though she's the one who let her dog off the leash and like ruin things for everyone else. And I think they do it in a way where they really like are condescending to whoever was complaining about them and was like really looking down on them. I don't remember the specifics of the scene, and I also don't know what like dog leash etiquette in the Regency era was. I just remember reading the scene and being like, I am rooting for zero of these people. I hate them both. There is a small part of me that wonders if Frederica is actually the most historically accurate Regency romance novel that I have started to read. I was gonna say read, but I've actually never fully read it, obviously. But, you know, the fact that I have read all of these Regency romances where like the heroes and heroines, like maybe they have other things I don't like about them, but at least they're not this smug. Like part of me is wondering, like maybe Frederica is right. Like maybe if you are reading about lords and the women they marry at this time, like would they actually be this smug? Like maybe, like maybe that is what they would be like. But even if it is super accurate, I don't care. Like I still don't want to read it. Now going back to books that I enjoyed, my next category is going to be my favorite recommendation from a friend. One of the simple joys from this year has just been reading books and talking about them with friends, and obviously there's ways that I do that like in public on BookTube and like with book clubs and stuff, but also like some of my old friends and I have just been kind of like texting each other and like being like, hey, I just read this book, it was really good, have you read it? And then we kind of like chat about it, and it's just been like a really nice informal way of like checking in on friends and also getting really good recommendations for things to read. So from these conversations, my favorite book that I've read based on a recommendation was Gin Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Annapura. The book takes place in the basti of an Indian city where our main character, Jai, is this 9-year-old. He's just, you know, going to school, he's got his friends, he's kind of doing your 9-year-old thing, except that his classmates keep going missing and the police are being really ineffective at finding them. But Jai has watched detective procedurals, he's got his friends, so he's decided that they're gonna go out and solve this mystery, and the book predominantly follows his point of view as we go through them trying to figure out what has happened to their friends and classmates. My friend recommended this book to me because we were talking about the weird complications of like who tells stories about India and poverty, and particularly Indian children who are growing up poor. And that is a key element of this book because it is built in part on Annapura's experience as a journalist covering these issues. And I don't think she's taking it for granted that that experience necessarily means that she's like inherently qualified to write this book, but she has this essay at the end that my friend in particular was like really like recommending that I get to about like this book and her aims and thought process kind of going into it, and like how she thinks of her responsibility in those regards, and that like kind of gets at what she thought was important to get across in Gin Patrol. I don't know that I'm like in a position to judge how well she accomplished those particular goals, but as a book, what I loved about Gin Patrol on the Purple Line are the characters she created. As a narrator, Jai is the ultimate in unreliable because he's 9 and he's trying to solve a mystery that has a lot of facets to it that he should probably not know about. And he's kind of like arrogant, impulsive in a way that's also, you know, childish because he is a child. And his friends and classmates, as well as his own sister, they have their own distinct flavors of childishness in a way that also plays really well off of just like the pure chaos of an Indian city. And it's not just like the kids of the book, there's also the parents and the way this whole community is formed that just felt so vivid. It reminded me of kind of like a suburban melodrama where you're like seeing a community like real from like something traumatic. At times the book is really joyful because you are seeing it through the eyes of children, but of course that makes the tragedy only more tragic. And when the book is hard to read, it's hard not just because of what the characters are going through in the moment and what you see of their feelings in the moment, but also because they're children, you have the sense of this future grief and frustration that they're going to be dealing with beyond the last few pages of the book. On a similar glum note, my next category is favorite stab in the heart, and this is going to Real Life by Brandon Taylor. If you were gonna make me talk about like only one book for all of 2020, if you were gonna really make me pick the book that I feel was like my favorite book of 2020, I would probably pick Real Life. It is a book that really hit me hard. I have a whole video about it, and so I will link to it down below if you want to hear me talk about this at length. Real Life follows Wallace, a biochemistry grad student, through a weekend of lab and friends. Wallace is Black and queer, which is driving some sense of isolation within his program, and he's also dealing with this very complicated grief around the death of his father. Plus, he's in fucking grad school. And Taylor is like unrelenting in his depiction of grad school as this place that like breeds misery in people, partly because of like their own choosing and partly because of other factors beyond their control. But I think also at the core of the story is understanding the ways that like even in these kinds of places where you feel obligated almost to a certain level of misery, there are ways to have something that feels real, that feels like an actual connection to other people. That leads me into my next category of my favorite science book that's not actually a science book. Real Life has nematodes in it, which is great, very exciting, love a nematode, but that pairs well with the book that I want to talk about for this category, which is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Mexican Gothic follows Noemi, a Mexican socialite who has to go to the countryside to basically see what's going on with her cousin who just married into this English family, and so she goes to visit her, but obviously then things get a little bit kind of unsettling. The house is creepy, the family's creepy, she's worried about her cousin. Noemi's got a lot to figure out. This is very much that kind of like slow, atmospheric kind of gothic horror where, you know, you've got a series of like unsettling, unexplained things happening, and then it just kind of like slowly creeps up, and then builds to a reveal. And that is all very much my jam. Give me your creepy houses, give me your slow plots. Like, I love that. But where this book really, really got me was the science, which I was really not expecting, but it turned out to play like a really huge, important role in the horror of this book. And it, you know, this is not a book that's like technically a science fiction novel, but it is playing with a lot of kind of like science-y things in the way that it's building its horror. And some of that is like very obvious stuff in the beginning where you're having this like really creepy English family that is like super eugenicist. The ways that that plays into like their like corrupted, like falling apart family is like one very fascinating element. And then the actual horror itself, like I do not want to like get into it here because it'll be very spoilery, but I was like super into that reveal, even though I also think it's a little bit bonkers. I just also love it. I did a review of Mexican Gothic and I will link to it down below as well with all the other like videos that I've done discussing books that I've talked about. But I think I'm gonna revisit it, and I said this in my original review, and I think I'm gonna like establish this as a goal for the year because I actually do really want to do this, which is gonna be a video about the science of a Mexican Gothic, because I just really love how Silvia Moreno Garcia like built all of that into the book, and I want to be able to get into like a full spoilery discussion of it. So we've got 3 more books, and they're gonna all be nonfiction things, and I'm gonna start with my least favorite nonfiction. And this is like, I feel like a little bit weird being like, this is my least favorite nonfiction because I am glad that I read it, but I do have some like pretty key frustrations with it that I think are important to note. And the book that I'm talking about is Dreamland by Sam Quinones. Dreamland is about the opiate epidemic. It ties together like the creation of OxyContin and the pharmaceutical industry and like how all of that works to the rise of black tar heroin to kind of basically get into this whole set of threads that are going to all weave together about like business and healthcare, how all of these things have woven together to drive the rise of opiates in America. And this of course also brings in the very heavy personal toll that the opiate epidemic has had on people and communities alike. Nicole and I picked this pretty early on in our nonfiction book club, and like I said, I am glad I read it, mostly for my own edification. The opiate epidemic has been something that I've been wanting to learn more about, and there's also like just so much big picture stuff that I didn't like fully appreciate in terms of like how our healthcare system is set up, and like also like even like some of this like weird business stuff that I really, really appreciated just sitting down and reading and learning it. I think especially one of the things that I got from this book was like kind of like how the American medical system is set up to treat pain in a way that is like really, really narrow, and that has kind of facilitated the rise of opiates overall. But again, this book I think had some flaws, and I think one of the big ones is just that it is super repetitive, which at first I thought was a deliberate choice. You're reading the same detail get repeated over and over and over again through different kind of points of view, and I thought that he was going to be building to something, but it didn't actually build to something. It was just the same detail repeated over and over and over again. And that like can be emphatic up until a point, and I think this book was several hundred pages past that point. And Quinones also makes a few extrapolations in the last few pages of this book that were a real head scratcher and like kind of like a record scratch just overall. I remembered when Nicole and I were getting ready for this, like I think she was still like not quite there yet, and I remember being like, I'm really curious about how you're gonna feel about those last few pages. Turns out we both had a lot of feelings about those last few pages, just because I feel like they play into a lot of tropes about how we talk, I don't know, about like culture overall that are like these really played out conversations around like trigger warnings and stuff like that, where it's just like, this does not seem related to me, and like taking this really big like sprawling picture that this book has painted and then reducing it to this really narrow conversation that barely seems relevant just like did not connect. And it's also like an extrapolation that I like vehemently disagree with. I respect and appreciate the work that Sam Quinones put into writing this work, because there has clearly been a lot of thought and care put into it, but these flaws were really significant to me in a way that just kind of really frustrated me with the book overall. Moving on to the next book, I think a common refrain as we've all looked back on 2020 has been the real kind of feeling of like, wait, that also happened this year. And that is how I feel about my favorite memoir of 2020, which is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, which is a memoir that is largely documenting her experience in an abusive relationship. The book has this fractured structure, taking on different literary forms to explore different parts of this relationship and her experience in it, as well as to take the personal elements and put them in this bigger context in terms of how we talk about queer relationships and particularly abusive relationships. That structure is really one of the things that I love about this book, and I sometimes worry that with how obsessed I am with that structure that I don't know, I'm somehow reducing it to some kind of gimmick, but I think that would do a huge disservice to it because it is clearly something that is very thought out. There's been clearly a lot of thought that has been put out into what section is going to take on what form, how are these sections going to be placed in a particular order. There's just clearly a lot of purpose that has gone into the structuring. One of the sections that I remember really, really strongly from my reading was the choose your adventure kind of section, which again, when you describe it, it feels gimmicky, but it has this really clear purpose. That choose your own adventure structure, part of why it was striking to me was because it just reminded me of one of my favorite recent books that I had read in the past few years, which is Jane Unlimited by Kristen Kishore, which also uses a similar kind of choose your own adventure style to it. And part of the reason why I loved it in Jane Unlimited is because it's taking the structure that a lot of us associate with, books that we read when we were a kid to tell the story of grief and adulthood, and most importantly of uncertainty. In the Dream House uses the choose your own adventure styling with a sort of similar fixation on uncertainty, but it's a scary uncertainty based on not knowing how your actions could set off your abusive partner. And that's just one of the sections that really stuck with me from my initial reading. But I feel like every section of this book has something interesting to think about in terms of why a particular form was chosen to tell that part of the story. And to also think about how many genres it takes to contain anyone's life. And for my last category for my 2020 recap, I've got my favorite nonfiction book of the year. And this was actually really tough because I have two that I really, really loved. And they were both books that Nicole and I talked about for Nonfiction Book Club. And I could talk about both of them, but I'm gonna just make myself pick one. And so I'm gonna go with Ghost in the Schoolyard by Eve L. Ewing. Ghost in the Schoolyard is her book documenting the closing of several Chicago public schools in 2013, which disproportionately affected Black communities. This book is based on Ewing's dissertation work, and that alone is striking to me, partly just because I'm always a little bit jealous because I'm no one ever wants to read my dissertation work, but also you shouldn't really want to. But also just more generally because even though she's writing this academic text, the book itself is super readable, which not to generalize is not always the case with academic writing, and I really wish more academic writers would take notes from this book. Ewing states early on that her goal with this book is to look into the question why, if these schools are seemingly so bad, everyone is saying that these schools are terrible, they're not serving students or whatever, why if they're so bad are the communities being served by them fighting so hard to keep them open? And to answer that question, Ewing takes on a lot. She's talking to people in the community. She's outlining how housing policy drove segregated schools in Chicago. She's dissecting the language used in public hearings. There's a lot in this book, but it never feels like a lot. It feels completely manageable, but also completely and totally informative. I've seen people talk about how housing policy drives so much racist stuff in the US, but this was my first time kind of diving into the specific mechanics of how that all plays out from the policy to the lived end. And again, to me, it felt she was just peacefully dumping a lot of information directly into my head. And so Ghost in the Schoolyard is a book that I feel I've learned a lot from, both in terms of the actual content of it, of what she's conveying in terms of her argument, and also just from how she's written it and how she has structured her book overall and been able to convey all of this information in a way that I feel I was able to gain so much from such a short book. My honorable mention for this favorite nonfiction category is Superior by Angela Saini, which is about the history of race science, and I also strongly recommend it. If you want to see Nicole and me discuss these books in more detail, I'll link to our live streams down below. You should also join us for future nonfiction book clubs because they're a lot of fun, and I always enjoy it. So thank you guys for watching. I feel this video has gone on for so fucking long. It's taken me twice as long to film this video as it usually does, so I'm sick of talking, but that's okay. So thank you guys for watching. Bye.